First off, thank you very much to everyone who has joined us tonight or this morning, wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to say a special thank you to anyone in the UK who's missing a big evening of Netflix or Premier League football, whatever the options were. Like everyone in the industry, since March last year, we at Dewhurst have been thinking through the short, medium, and long-term impacts of the pandemic on our industry and our business. In this webinar, we're going to explore what the longer-term impacts of the pandemic may or may not be. Will the use of Zoom and Teams change the requirement for office space in the future? Have lockdowns become a recognized public health instrument, and how will this affect lift service contracts? And will regular engineer site visits become a thing of the past? Our three speakers will explore these questions and more over the course of the next hour. So the format of this event will be 3 8 to 10 minute presentations with around 15 minutes at the end reserved for Q&A. So as we're going along, if you just put any questions in the chat bar, then I will pose those to our speakers in the Q&A section. Our speakers today are from a cross-section of the industry and are located in different continents around the world. So we've got Patrick in California, Richie and Dean in Melbourne, and Matt, who's locked down in London. With that, let me introduce our first speaker, Patrick Daly. Patrick's the director of Woods Bagot and has extensive experience in high-rise design and developments across the world. Woods Bagot are thought leaders in the future of workplace design, and Patrick is also a contributor to the Immune Building Standard. With that, Patrick, I'll hand over to you to share your screen and run us through the material you have prepared.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I really appreciate you inviting me to join this call. First of all, is the screen something that everyone can see? Title hashtag where to from here?
Yes. Yeah, that's good.
Very good. That was the scariest part of this 10-minute effort so far. As you all might imagine, the aspiration to kind of get ahead of this thing with thought pieces is something that just about everybody in the industry, architects, interior designers, lift consultants, and etc., has been kind of pushing out articles about as fast as they're pushing out buildings and designs these days. So what I started with are just a few slides from one of my colleagues who's doing a future workplace strategy. And some of these things we think are going to take hold and some of them aren't. But as we look at it, we are quite confident that no matter what happens post-COVID, the allowance for what we call a self-orientated work mode will, at least at some level, remain for the duration, or I should say for the long term. And to that end, we are planning our specifically workplace design so that the anticipation of either a reduction in future office space, a reduction in or an increase of flexibility of where people are working, and if it's about a singular office, do we downsize our space? And if it's about designing a high-rise building with a lift core, are we advising a reduction in lifts ultimately, or is it based on social distancing just the opposite, and in fact an increase in lifts? The where's the office slide is about the fact that maybe like most of you, our office, which happens in London to be isolated in Fitzrovia, is actually arguably somewhere north of 60 different offices around the entire, at least transitable region of Greater London. And so we're starting to accept that kind of diaspora as, at least to a certain percentage, the future work strategy of our studio in London, as well as our studios around the globe. And so we're trying to think about how those spaces might modify. This slide was done in terms of kind of trying to understand a workplace circulation story. I left it in to this discussion because it poses two things: that you might have a multitude of access points in a high-rise development, whether it be mixed use or single use, and to that end, you might actually encourage in the future a heightened degree of dispersion of core areas. The image on the right actually suggests that a core could be subdivided and that individuals might populate a single tenancy coming from completely different locations. The challenge of fire exiting is clearly a sense, but if that's the case, we might start to think of centralized cores as being one byproduct or one reduction byproduct of the future of high-rise lift core design. If that's the case, do we have an opportunity of providing lift conditions where the proximity to a perimeter wall increases the ability of natural ventilation and possibly the ability of kind of increasing the glass lift opportunity? This slide was a notion of an arrival, as I said, a multiple arrival point. But one of the important things for us here is that if you can dictate and understand who's coming to your building, you can also, to a greater degree of certainty, schedule those individuals and use that scheduling to create a vibrancy and an excitement about not only a common, say, podium mixed use space, but also conceptually tenancies higher up in the building, whether they be common spaces in a residential building or indeed multi-floor tenancies for workspaces. My colleagues on the call are known global experts in these subjects regarding touchless and smarter move for intuitive buildings. For us in this study, it became an anticipation that what is in everybody's hand or pocket at the moment might become an even more essential way of moving in and out of their day-to-day work or life environment, as well as moving in and out of a tenancy. And that ability to dictate who is coming in and out of a building and exactly what their location is, even in fact allowing them what I call a chartered ride experience to lifts, would be something that gives us a much heightened degree of sensitivity to where people are and where the densities of people are, and indeed, if you take that one step further, what the health status of each of those individuals is. Again, the building monitoring systems are already at a high level. As Peter described, I'm doing some work on immune buildings, and the next layer of that is the ability to actually not just anticipate climatically or population-wise who's in your building, but in fact to be able to regulate kind of levels of particulate matter in the air in a space, in a tenancy, or in fact be able to relegate different levels of humidity for kind of optimum germ attentive spaces. This is a study that we did recently with my colleagues in the London office, and what we were asked to do by the developer is look at a building that's actually under construction right now. It happens to be in Pitt Street, above an underground line. And could you imagine, even though we're not going to change this property, how the future use might actually modify the core of the building, just as a study? So what we did is we imagined an individual user, and that user is actually in the future dictated by a much closer understanding of this individual. Her name's Anna's day-to-day reality. Wake up call, looking at her meetings, apps, and in her case, a bicycle ride to the Pitt Street building. The bicycle ride allows her an invitation to a concierge situation of a valet at the bike park, at the end of trip facilities, and it allows her to then monitor her next kind of layer activity in the building, which is very much of what I would call a membership environment going forward, so that she can meet individuals in a much closer kind of sense of where the individuals are, when her meetings are over the sweep of the day. So it's not a punch clock environment where from 9 to 5, she's in the building and doing very predictable things. It's a much more dynamic situation that is based on daily meetings, daily opportunities for gathering of friends, as well as actually individual downtime. The Chartered Express story is one I was telling my colleagues was also appended to an article that described lifts as anxiety boxes, which I thought was a very scary thing to see. But in pandemic reality, getting into any tight space with strangers is, as you might all agree, is a challenging situation right now. The typical core of the building that we were asked to look at is thus. And the notion that we described was that in the future, you might look at tenancies and co-working spaces where the individual stack or series of stacks of a single tenant or a partnered tenant were much more kind of collective environments where those tenants knew more about the kind of health and the behavior patterns of those individual users was within a pocket of a high-rise building. Secondly, the notion that the core space could be loosened up in some manner so that general ventilation, vertical ventilation, atrium space, as well as visual connectivity could be increased was the driver for this study. Where we took it was the notion of if we needed to find a standardized central atrium, could we actually rethink the location of a typical 6-bank low-rise, 6-bank high-rise lift, find that what I'm calling 120 square meters, and figure out ways of either modifying the lifting strategy, a double stacked lift or an increase in the number of lifts, or thirdly, and I'm curious, modify the number of lifts by reducing the cab size so that you could actually have a larger number of lifts in a 120 square meter bank environment. So we looked at that, and the notion here, based on kind of driving an immune strategy, is that you have a common atrium with a stair in it where you are much more likely to connect with friends, have visual acuity on a single floor plate, as well as an ability of creating natural ventilation in the center of what would otherwise be a pretty simple standard center core building. The visual acuity then could have the complement of additional meeting spaces, and then ultimately could have the ability of that kind of circulation, if you're ambulatory and able to do so, moving up and down stairwells, which would further reduce the need for, I'll say it last time, anxiety boxes of getting into a lift. Although I think ultimately that whole thing is going to dissipate. But what might not dissipate is the fact that people are scheduling their lives and their workflow in the future based on a much more kind of tight understanding of meeting to the meeting rather than a 9-to-5 solution. Now, lastly, I pulled out two paradigms, and one of them is a commercial bay project that I did with Woods Baggett and a partner architect in Auckland, Warren Imani. It was completed about 2 years ago, but the reason I thought it was a good example is it's a rear core glass lift condition. The rear core, somewhat like Leadenhall, if you're in London, is an opportunity of separating the lifts into a low and a high rise bank and having them completely separate from the lease space. The glazed core that the glass lift sits in is a separate ventilation. It was done in this project because of the heat gain in that space, but could be done in such a way in a kind of an immune sensibility so that you could also ventilate those cabs, as far as I understand it. Now, the last thing, I dropped in a slide related to high-rise residential, and this building I thought was a good thing to end on, because the story here is that a standard bank of 6 lifts was the original design. There were nominally about 12 lifts per level, depending on what level. It's a luxury building in Vietnam. But what we proposed to the client is that typical 6 lift environment could be, if you double the number of lifts, a effectively private lift lobby for each of the tenants in the whole footprint. And even though you're doubling the number of lifts, you could reduce the size of the cab and effectively increase the exclusivity or the sense of luxury for the building itself. And given the population of the project, anticipate that a keyed-in system could allow you to circulate in and out of effectively your own lift into your own private lift lobby without interaction with others. So it's potentially in the future not just a luxury building solution, but possibly something that also addresses future anticipated sense of proximity to others. So I think I overshot, so I apologize, Peter, but that's my quick assessment. And I'll stop share.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I think you only mentioned that lifts were anxiety boxes sort of 2 or 3 times. So
I couldn't. It was front of mind. I had promised to say something controversial in the talk.
Yeah,
so
no, that was the brief. So our next speakers, Richie Lobert and Dean Morgan, are directors and founders of L&L Lift Consultants. Over the past 8 years, Richie and Dean have built one of Australia's leading lift consultancies. So I'm going to hand over to them to give an overview of how the pandemic is affecting their customers and what they think the future holds. So over to you guys.
No worries. Thank you very much. I must firstly say that was a great presentation we just saw.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very hard to follow. I feel a little bit like a local comedian coming in after Robin Williams has just done a presentation. So it was very, very interesting.
I'll take the Robin Williams as a compliment.
That's right. And particularly, yeah, I found it very interesting with regards to, the possible use of small lift cars, seeing we have to, at this stage have less people in lifts, but very good. So my name's Dean Morgan, one of the directors of LML Lift Consultants.
And Richie over here.
And Richie beside us here. So we just wanted to talk today about existing buildings, essentially. So what we deal with in Australia, and we do consultancies right across Australia and New Zealand and Papua New Guinea with our team. But we predominantly specialise in modernisation projects and service agreements, design and the like. So we're not so much involved in the new space, but of course there's a lot of existing lift or existing commercial and residential buildings that need to find ways to both keep and attract tenants in this day and age. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that further.
Yep. And it's always difficult for existing buildings to compete with the likes of what Patrick just went through. But it's interesting because what we're finding from our perspective is that there's been a hell of a lot of increase in inquiries. And for the normal reasons, so in other words, technology and trying to keep up with other buildings, aging equipment, reliability. So you're sort of looking at upgrades of machines and controllers and the like. But there's certainly a lot of inquiries on the back of that to include some of these sort of COVID type products, if that's the word, things like the air purification to be retrofitted to lift cars, certainly voice activation units and gesture controls and all the touchless technologies, including the app-based type technologies and the likes, right down to sort of information screens within lift cars. It started with some decals and some signage and things like that, and now it's turned into having the big information screens providing lift users with relevant information. So certainly, we're finding that some of these tenants of sort of premium and A-grade buildings will be looking for that sort of building that can offer some of these products as well. So that's certainly part of what's been happening here.
Yeah, so as Richie was saying, we found that a lot of clients, particularly in these A-grade and premium grade assets, and a lot with what conventional lift systems, are looking at overlaying even DCS control systems, and we're doing a few major jobs at the moment where they're actually looking at overlaying DCS onto control systems that aren't too old, but they feel that will give them more capability and the use of apps and the like on telephones for tenants to be able to not only call lifts but just the freedom of not having to touch anything. We've also seen a lot of behavioural changes in buildings. So we've noticed that, in Melbourne for a while, you might have seen that we had an extended lockdown period. We then went back to where there was allowed to be 50% of the building population in CBD buildings. In Melbourne, that's now changed to 75% of people are allowed back into the buildings. And this has created that anxiety around the anxiety box, as it was called before, with regards to people, coming back to work. And a lot of business owners are actually finding it difficult to even get back to the 75% that's now allowed in the CBD buildings, because people have become increasingly used to working from home, increasingly used to using technology like we're using now, and so therefore they've basically finding it difficult to get back. So they need to find ways around ensuring people that the lifts are safe to use. And some of that's been behavioural, where they're asking for staggered start and finish times in buildings to ease the peaks, to allow people less people in the lifts. hand sanitizer stations outside of the lift cars and asking people to sanitize before they get into the lifts. Things, compulsory mask wearing in some buildings. Some buildings in Australia at the moment, it's not compulsory to wear masks in the workspace. It was a while ago, but that's just been lifted. But some building owners are recommending that you wear masks when in lift cars. So all of that is to obviously reduce the exposure chance, which is quite minimal. I know some of the major lift companies have done studies on, the percentage reduction of possibly getting infected by viruses or bacteria when you're wearing a mask in a lift, not in a lift for a very long time, and then using other technology. So you've got the behavioural and the technology changes. So as we mentioned, DCS capabilities, using apps on iPhones and things like that, limiting the number of passengers via reprogramming the DCS so that fewer people are allocated to the cars, introducing that technology that can interface with the various systems, touchless buttons, and button modifiers such as the Dewhurst Halo that we've been looking at. We haven't actually seen in use yet, but looking at how it's used is very interesting, and I can see that type of technology would be a great for buildings with conventional lift systems, whereby you don't have to physically replace all the buttons and things, but you can transfer them into a touchless technology. We've been involved a little bit with voice recognition software. That, from what we've seen there, can be a little bit touch and go. It's sometimes has to be programmed, and we've had to, on the few jobs that we've done with it, we've had to have, for a while, there's some fairly specific instructions on what to say to the lift. It tends to like you to use manners. So if you don't exactly say it the way they like,
that's true.
It rejects it.
It doesn't like the Australian accent. That's what it is.
No, exactly. The introduction of air purification units in lift cars, ionisation and stuff like that, it's something that we're seeing a big take up on. I was reading the other day that one of the lift companies have published something that shows 20 to 30% reduced relative risk, with the introduction of that type of technology, and even further with 50% if you're wearing masks in lift cars and things like that. So we found that to be quite interesting.
Yep. And then it even sort of moves into, the other part of something we do a lot of is auditing in the service space, and we're heavily involved in the service side of the industry. And as part of our just regular equipment audits, that is basically sort of bread and butter stuff. Property owners are certainly asking questions around, hey, what can we retrofit? So, as part of the whole maintenance audit process, which usually results in a maintenance agreement being taken to tender as well at some point thereafter, they're certainly asking for a bit of a shopping list of what can be done, and in terms of some of the lower hanging fruit that they can look at doing at relatively low cost. So obviously at the time of tendering a maintenance agreement, that's the time to ask the lift companies to provide some pricing on some of these options, and then they can sort of choose what they would like to implement. And that's certainly happening all the time, and people are really across it in terms of the property owners and building owners, and they really request that to be looked at closely every time we do an audit as well.
Absolutely. And one of the other things we've seen that during this, of course, with the buildings sitting empty or at a reduced population, you've got much less lift use, and therefore possibly some reduced exposure for the lift companies. We have had some clients asking us about clauses within maintenance agreement to do with occupancy discounts, and whether it's possible to have anything in there around occupancy discounts caused by pandemics and things like that. That's a very touchy subject, of course, I think, with lift companies, and for various reasons, and we understand a lot of their reasonings behind that. But it is something that a lot of clients have started to ask the question on, because if they're losing rents, or if they're losing, getting reduced floor spaces and things like that, they are definitely having a problem with their cash flow and their occupancies within these buildings. and are therefore looking for some relief from suppliers who may also have reduced risk and servicing requirements during those times.
Yep.
I don't know whether you had anything else to add.
That's probably, I think we've sort of run over time, have we? But that's basically in the modernisation and service space in a nutshell. But there's certainly the main thing is that there's all these products being considered in this side of the industry as well, and it's forever changing. So I think you'll see a lot of this being installed in the future in existing buildings as well.
Very good.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Thank you.
And there are some really interesting points there. Just sort of a 30-second product plug from me. Just that we've retrofitted our Halo, a prototype of our Halo product to our lift about 3 months ago now. And we just want to make sure that it's, before fully releasing a production product to market, we want to make sure everything is smooth with it, and people just haven't pushed buttons for the last 3 months. And so we consider it the perfect retrofit solution to sit on top of your traditional push button control, and to complement it and give people that touchless interface. Great. I think there are some really interesting things to think about, and I've certainly got some questions for you guys for when we move to the Q&A. But next off is Matt. So Matt is the head of strategic marketing at Avaya, and Matt is probably the definitive thought leader, especially in the UK, on future trends and how technology is going to impact our industry. So I'm going to hand over to him to speak about remote monitoring and how the pandemic has sped the shift in that direction.
Thank you, Peter. Well, no pressure after that introduction. So hopefully I've got some good content to share here. As Peter said, I'm based in London, and we're in our 3rd lockdown now. Seems to be earlier every year. And you know, it's caused a lot of uncertainty. But one of the conversations that we've been having for a long time in this industry that's really been turned on its head by a lot of this is the conversation about remote monitoring. So just to take a slight step back, this is a slide that I've used a few times over the last year or so when I talk about the current state of our industry. And when we talk about remote monitoring, we tend to refer to it as a lift monitoring system, LMS. And the simple question I ask is, of the lifts which you have under service, how many have LMS installed? And the answer almost always is none. And you have occasionally specific installations or specific clients, such as we see it in local government hospitals, high-end commercial in some cases, universities and campus sites where they have some form of system installed. But if we then drill a little deeper and say, well, of those monitoring systems, how many provide remote access? Then it's almost always none. Some of the OEM systems are a key exception here, but that access does vary. So as we sit here today, you know, hopefully now coming out the other side of the pandemic, we're seeing lift monitoring systems as the exception, not the norm. They're typically in-building systems with little remote access. But something that I wanted to pick up on here is something that's been a common theme in our industry and in buildings in general, which is that we want to see an engineer. Now, what do I mean by that? What we're talking about here is, you know, if we look at building services, there's a desire to say, I'm paying for this asset to be serviced in case this lift. If there's something wrong or if there's something needs doing, I want to see that engineer with their toolkit in my building. However, we're now moving to a world where every visitor you're bringing into that building can potentially be viewed as a virus carrier. So whilst we've seen a lot in Patrick's presentation about how you would manage your tenants and so on, service providers coming onto site represent a real risk in a lot of cases. Now, we've already seen this here in the UK and in other markets with lift engineers struggling to gain access to sites, or indeed being asked to present proof of a negative test. I've done 2 site visits in the last 2 weeks, and I've needed to have a lateral flow test before each one. That's 2 more times than I've ever wanted to stick a swab down the back of my throat and up my nose, but there we are, it's what we have to do. So as buildings are reopening, even after successful vaccine rollouts and all of the positivity we're seeing, there's still going to be a concern about outbreaks in the local area, but outbreaks in your building. Therefore, minimizing the need for these, let's say, outside agents, as engineers are going to be viewed, to come in has become a discussion with property managers. Now, remote monitoring systems are going to allow us to have those engineers attend site, but only when they're needed, and they'll be able to arrive ready to start the work straight away. Now, this leads me on to something which is a key bugbear of mine, which is that previously these systems have been sold, and I'm going to say it missold, as a way to reduce maintenance to save cost. Now, I think that's fundamentally misleading because you still need to perform maintenance. You can't reduce maintenance. It's not safe to reduce maintenance either. What we're talking about here is reducing the amount of time you need to spend on site. So for a starter, that's planned maintenance. If you need to bring an engineer into your building, if you're essentially viewing that person as a risk, they should arrive knowing exactly what they need to do, when they need to be there, and even include the option for earlier intervention so that you can plan that at a time where your building's going to be less busy. Not as we used to look at this from a point of view of, I don't want a lift out of service at a busy time, but now saying, I don't necessarily want this engineer in my building when I've got a lot of people circulating around. The other key point here is less time fault finding. If the engineer can arrive on site armed with the knowledge of what's going on, they're going to be able to get to the root cause quicker and fundamentally be in and out of your building quicker. The best example I can use here is the classic one of a passenger entrapment. If an engineer arrives on site knowing where the position of the lift is in the shaft, you're not going to get what we still see a lot today of a lift engineer walking upstairs, stopping at each landing and tapping on the door to see if he's got to the point where the passenger is. If they can arrive and know what floor the passenger's at, where the lift is at, they can perform that release a lot quicker and get that lift back into service and be on their way. There's also the ongoing subject of fewer breakdowns. This is important because it allows engineers to focus on doing that maintenance and modernisation work, which fundamentally keeps lifts running. Breakdowns mean attendance at short notice. So if you're requiring people who've got negative tests to attend building, are there engineers available who've got a negative test? And we always used to talk about breakdowns during sort of unsociable hours as being at, late at night or on the weekend and so on. I think what we're now talking about is, a breakdown when you're trying to get part of that staggered start into or out of the building. You don't want that lift going down. The other thing this can reduce is the classic running on arrival call out. If there's remote access to the lift status, it allows the service company to feed back to the client where there's really nothing wrong. Classic cause of a running on arrival is that the doors are blocked on an upper floor, somebody's placing a call on a lower floor, and to untrained people in the building, that's going to look like a breakdown. You don't need a lift engineer to attend site to solve that issue. You need someone to go and kick the box out of the door, which is being blocked on an upper level. So I think these are really simple examples of what this can do. But if we think about it in the context of minimizing the amount of time that engineer needs to spend on site and planning when they arrive, it's really very important. I couldn't do a remote monitoring presentation without hitting key buzzwords of predictive maintenance and condition-based maintenance. All I'll say on that is right now it's about remote access to lift status. There's a lot of clever systems being worked on out there by a lot of very clever people. What I would caution everybody on this call to do is if you are being presented with one of these, ask this one question. Give me an example of one thing the system has actually predicted, and see what that person presenting tells you. Not a lot of people are going to thank me for that, but there we are. And just to finish off really quickly, here's an example of the different things that we can read from an LMS platform. This is our what we call LMS Lite, but we can straight away see here, we can tell the position of the car in the shaft. We can see the door status, so we know if the lift is stopped, but the doors are open or closed. We can actually get an idea of trips, runs, and journeys, which allows us to better plan our maintenance. There's specific lift status available there, such as whether you've got an out of service signal and so on. And also individual equipment status for things like understanding battery faults, mains power faults. This is an example here with one of our gateways where we can check the signal coverage. All of that can be available securely on any internet capable device. So that can be in the hands of a supervisor, in the hands of a building manager, or even down to a lift engineer with their smart device on their way to a building. I think I'm just about on time there and hopefully got through all that. My slides weren't quite as pretty as Patrick's, and I hope I'll be forgiven for that. Peter, I'll hand back to you.
Very good.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. That's really interesting stuff. So I guess we are now in the Q&A phase of the webinar. I've got a couple to kick off. I guess I'll start with the first one. I think we've all experienced being in and out of lockdowns, and that's impacted the number of people using lifts and building owners' ability to charge out rent. Rich and Dean, you touched on it, but have you had people ask you for lockdown clauses in service contracts, or what are building owners thinking from that perspective?
Yeah, we have. So we've previously had and seen in various contracts occupancy clauses for different things, but never around something like a pandemic. You know, normally we do see clauses in various lift maintenance contracts around, if the building drops by 20% tenancy, the maintenance fee would reduce and all these types of things. But there's definitely we have received a few, I wouldn't say a lot, but we have received a few inquiries now about whether they can specifically put the word pandemic into the occupancy clauses as well, to say that, yeah, okay, we haven't lost the tenants, however, we've lost the tenants for an interim period, or we've had to reduce our rents, or provide rent relief to the tenants and things like that. And can that somehow be reflected in the lifts, and whether that's shutting down lifts, turning lifts off, and running with a reduced number of lifts and therefore a reduced number of maintenance. But they also see it as reduced exposure for the lift companies, because there's not going to be as many breakdowns or as great a wear and tear on the equipment because it's not running. And particularly in the retail environment is another one that was hit very heavily in Australia, and particularly in Melbourne, where some of the major shopping centres were shut down for long periods of time. So moving walks and escalators and the like just weren't running. So yeah, no, it definitely has come up.
Yeah.
It's a difficult one.
Again, you both touched on the fact that sort of Melbourne was now back at 75% capacity in offices, and companies are struggling to pull people back into buildings. I'm going to pass this one on to Patrick. What do you think companies can do specifically? I guess, what do you think companies can do to make people happy about moving into these spaces again, with particular focus on the anxiety boxes?
Well, there are a lot of things that my colleagues here brought up, just in terms of kind of cosmetic maintenance and strategic modification of the behavior, and the decals and cleanliness, and being able to monitor that at a heightened degree. I was thinking something similar, because my presentation was a little bit more of a structural modification that may or may not take hold. It all depends on where, ultimately COVID is controlled, and how many, if any, of these behavior strategies actually start to modify the business itself. But one thing that we're seeing is ideally the end, or the beginning of the end, of the open office strategy. And this is something that, quite honestly, I've been pushing for 20 years in high-rise buildings, where a single kind of open tenancy was the way to go. And what we've been seeing even before COVID is a much more compartmentalized solution. So imagine the future that buildings actually look more tangibly like they did 20, 30 years ago in terms of separate hard-walled tenancies, and that those become in some way the norm, ironically, and that with the advent of kind of a heightened degree of control of the staff moving in and out of spaces, to a heightened degree of understanding the vertical circulation, the lobbies and the lifts, into an isolated tenancy that is then, from a germ and humidity standpoint, more controlled, is something that we're imagining design will go to. So the short-term answer to what you're asking is that it's all about the known. And the more that you can know about the path of travel through an individual or a team or a company in and out of the building, it creates a level of surety that starts to conceptually increase the behavior pattern of people moving back into the spaces.
I've just had a question from the audience. So Patrick's idea of increasing the number of lift cores, potentially with smaller surface area, is an interesting one in both residential and offices. Do Richie and Dean think that this is likely to happen?
I think it's going to. I actually found it very interesting myself, to be honest. I think it's really going to depend on where we see this pandemic heading, and with the rollout of vaccines and things like that, to see whether it's a long-term concern, and therefore, you know, that would roll out to some massive changes, I think, in the way buildings are designed. That's been spoken about today. But I really do think it's, you know, probably the next 18 months or so are going to be the telling points for that. Yeah, I just think that it's something that it's a massive change to go to something like that. It's obviously, even with the small lift cars, is going to add a lot of cost in the construction of the building, I would imagine.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, without rambling too much, I think it's really going to depend on where we see ourselves with this pandemic, and what level of concern is left for future pandemics following this.
And we've
If I can just,
been,
sorry, please, Richie. No, please, Richie, go ahead.
Sorry, Patrick. I was just going to add, in terms of the residential space, you know, we're seeing, you know, increase in destination control technologies for other reasons. So, you know, traditionally, you know, you don't necessarily have destination control in many residential buildings, but, you know, for other reasons, it's starting to be more asked for, or the norm. And I remember back when, you know, destination control was first a thing, that, you know, there was talk about reducing the number of elevators overall in the building. But then it was always a consideration to keep the performance levels higher and have something up your sleeve. So really interesting, everything you went through, Patrick, for sure. It's yeah.
Well, there was a notion there, follows on from Peter's question about the so-called chartered ride. Could you come to your office space at an exact time and either get a cab that has been ordered for you or your team, your bubble, if you will, and could you get to that level of kind of definition of who's in your cab with you? And, you know, maybe it's a crazy thing. In the residential example, what I didn't describe is the fact that the individual, the tenant and his or her guests are in the private lift, but what I didn't describe is that the service access, fire stairs, and fire lifts are in a completely separate system that is accessed separately. And it allowed that owner to dumb down the common corridor and not spend money on finishes. Furthermore, it suggests that if you're concerned in a luxury environment, I hate to say it, but if your servicing or your maid service or what have you is a point of concern about cleanliness, if they're moving through kind of different circulation systems, maybe that becomes more common. But as you could see, he was more than willing to double the amount of money he spent on lifts, with the perception of offsetting that by separating where people were coming from and to, and providing presumably a kind of an individual ride in the lift itself.
Yes, and I remember a presentation I saw many, many years ago with the introduction of destination control, and that was around something that you sort of just spoke on, where they were sort of saying that, you know, if you're in a premium grade asset building that, you know, might have 2 different legal firms operating or more in the building, that you could basically present your card and the list will only group people from one organisation. you know, into one lift. So therefore you can feel comfortable that you're traveling with other people from your company or your floor or whatever it might be, which sort of gets back to what you're touching on there as well.
Yeah.
Question for Matt. So on safety, safety is becoming ever more important, and I think COVID is really trying to highlight on safety in lifts. What have Avaya seen from that perspective from your customers and the demands there for visible safety?
So it's an interesting one, really, because we like everybody else looked at the wave of, call them anti-COVID products or whatever you like, coming in. And we looked at a few different things, but I think really a lot of what we saw actually was most buildings now are going for the easiest options today. So we're seeing exactly as described by the guys from LML, use of decals, use of deployment of hand sanitizing stations and so on. We've seen certainly increased interest in putting, need to be careful with how I describe this, more fully featured, I nearly said better displays, but more fully featured displays into lift cars, again, so that you can communicate with passengers more. I think, you know, the days of just viewing the display as an indicator of direction of travel and floor, people are now coming around to, well, look, this is a way I can communicate with people in my building. And if I need to communicate, you know, occupancy levels and so on, then why not do it through a display? Indeed, a retrofittable option. So we've seen that. We've seen, obviously, there's a lot of what I might call sort of fringe cases out there for different things. You know, we experimented with some occupancy equipment as well, whereby you had a camera in the car. The camera would then link to a processor and would be able to pick up on the number of people in the car and issue a verbal warning if it exceeded what you saw as your COVID safe limit. Our thought with that was we were seeing buildings going back to almost having the elevator attendants and dispatchers in the lobbies and in the cars directing people, which obviously puts building staff at risk. I think with a lot of these, though, what we've come up against is we're not far enough out of this yet to really understand what people need. You know, we did some trials, it worked well. We spoke to a lot of companies about it, but ultimately the buildings aren't reoccupying yet. So I feel a little bit like a broken record because we've been in and out of lockdown and it's all been about, oh, we're about to reoccupy. Really, we haven't hit that point yet. And until we do, I think it would be rash to try and understand where the industry is going to find that level.
Question from Colin Edwards. What are our thoughts on retrofitting UV handrail sanitizing to existing escalators? I guess, Richie and Dean, one for you. What have you been speaking to customers about on this side?
Yeah, well, either. Okay. We're one in the same. Yeah, look, there's certainly been a lot of inquiries around that, and from my perspective, what I found interesting was, you know, there's products that are hidden as such, and there's products that are external and very visible, and therefore they're likely to be damaged more than something that's within the truss. But having said that, you know, we've had some clients that really want this device visible and external with plenty of signage around it, because for the same reasons, they too would like to attract people back into their retail spaces. And if that's a way in doing that, then so be it. But it's interesting that they don't necessarily, you know, they're running the risk of the unit being damaged. However, they really want people to see that they're doing everything humanly possible to get people back within their centres.
And I think that's because it brings into play another safety issue, you know, and again, it's a human behavioural issue, which isn't our area of expertise, but, you know, are people in retail, large retail centres are going to be afraid to hold the handrail and therefore, you know, start using escalators and moving walks dangerously by not holding the handrail because they're too concerned about germs and things on the handrail. So therefore, getting back to what Richie said, to have that fitted, even just as a level of reassurance and well advertised. So therefore, hopefully changing that behaviour and getting people to ride safely by holding the handrail, because it gives them that level of comfort.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the external units and people wanting to see them. We've had quite a backlash against those in the UK from a safety and hand trapping point of view. And I know there's different designs that have done different things. But I think the vandalism angle is always one, but I think there's enough safety concerns on an escalator without adding an additional pinch point. So we've seen a few people test these, but nobody able to really get round that level of safety concern. So from what I've seen over here, I suspect it will be the truss-mounted units that will win out. For exactly those reasons. People don't want to touch the handrail. So I think it'll be a mix of truss-mounted units, probably with then some form of signage.
Absolutely.
Because equally, I've certainly been, in the last few weeks, I've been somewhere and there was a woman spraying the handrail and then wiping it with what looked like makeup removal wipes. And I was just thinking, I don't think the handrail's rated for any of that. That's going to be a problem further down the line.
Yes. Yeah. No, and 100% agree with your comments there. Yep. Absolutely, with the internal units, and then probably with some good signage to give that level of reassurance. Then we need some remote monitoring on it from the VIA to make sure that it's still operating.
There you go.
That it hasn't failed and not been picked up on maintenance.
Any further questions for the panel today? Any last remarks from you guys?
Well, from our side, I just wanted to say, thanks for having us along, and thanks to the other speakers and to everyone that's tuned in. It's nice to see some familiar faces and everyone else as well. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
I agree. It's fascinating to kind of get into what I might call the bones of the industry. People like me have been kind of talking about lifts in the sense of kind of challenging their number and their size and location for careers. But ultimately, if we're talking about something that might need a product that broadly would need to be modified for a kind of future condition that gets really interesting. Obviously lifts aren't going away. In fact, they will likely, the more I think about this, kind of increase in their kind of level of interest of detail and the real kind of tangible things that you guys have been talking about, and something that's I learned from. My initial concern with COVID is that things like lifts would start to fall off in terms of kind of value. And I did notice something that Otis went public last April, and I went online and found that they're up 22%. So I'm guessing the lift business is alive and well. And ultimately, if they're cosmetic modifications, or as I described, more structural modifications, those are the beating heart of particularly tall mixed-use buildings. And the more we understand their potential ability to offset things like kind of human interaction and potentially human germ share in cases like this, the better off we are. So it was really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and I'll echo what everybody else has said. It's been great to have this time and have this forum. I think the one thing I would say is, we're a conservative industry, and rightly so, because we're a safety related industry, but I think we do need to challenge ourselves on being more open-minded to different approaches, to new equipment, to try, there's always been this, I don't want to go first. I don't want my building to be first. Well, somebody needs to be first. And, there are definitely things we'll have to rethink. And I think we just all need to be open to that, because the world has changed. And, whether it's going to be a massive step change or a small change, we don't know, but change will come. And we need to be open to that and ready for it.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much to the three speakers for joining, and then thank you very much to everyone else for taking the time to come and listen to us. I hope it's been useful. We will post a recording on our social media platforms. So if you want to share the discussion, then that would be useful. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, guys.